Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared, as Nur Jahan was born Mehr-un-Nissa in 1577, not in the grand courts of Agra or Lahore, but in the uncertainty of exile. Her family, Persian nobility displaced by courtly upheaval, had journeyed eastward across barren lands, seeking refuge under the rising power of the Mughal Empire. Her father, Koyas Beg, arrived in India with little more than his learning and ambition, eventually securing a position in Emperor Akbar's court as a clerk, then treasurer, and finally rising to the title of Itimad-ud-Dawla. But in those early years, the family's survival was fragile. It was not wealth or lineage that would define Mehr-un-Nissa. It was how she moved through corridors of silence, how she learned to observe before she was seen. As a child, she walked the margins of imperial privilege, neither hidden nor entirely present. She saw her father's steady climb, marked not by battle, but by ledgers and loyalty. She watched the empire expand under Akbar, who welcomed men of intellect regardless of origin, creating a bureaucracy where an outsider could rise if he moved carefully. And so she learned that power was not always seized by force. It could be held by those who understood how to speak without speaking too much. In the Mughal world, influence did not always arrive with a sword. Sometimes it arrived veiled behind a screen or in the form of a letter passed from hand to hand. She would become fluent in all of them. Her first entry into royal politics came not through her father, but through marriage. In 1594, she was married to Ali Quli Khan, later known as Sher Afghan, a military commander under the Mughals. They lived far from the center of power, in Bengal, a province marked by its own tensions and strategic importance. There, she was a wife, a mother, and a silent observer to the ambitions of men tasked with enforcing the empire's reach. But even on the eastern edges of the Mughal map, politics ran deep. Her husband's growing unease with court policy and his suspected sympathy toward rivals made him a threat. When Sher Afghan was killed in disputed circumstances in 1607, either resisting arrest or falling in an orchestrated conflict, Mehr-un-Nissa was brought to the imperial court as a widow and placed into the harem of Emperor Akbar's successor, Jahangir. For 4 years, she lived in the zenana, the secluded women's quarters of the palace. These were not idle years. The Mughal harem was not simply a place of retreat. It was a world of politics wrapped in silence, where influence moved in quiet waves and alliances were stitched not just through blood, but through proximity. Here, Mehr-un-Nissa observed the rhythms of the court from within, learning who held real power and how it shifted in the emperor's favor. Jahangir, though emperor, struggled with dependency, both on substances and on those who surrounded him. He ruled an empire of architects and rebels, scholars and spies, and his court was one of deep intrigue. In this fragile balance, one figure began to rise, not through birthright, but through an unshakable presence that others learned to feel before they dared to name it. In 1611, Jahangir married her. The name Mehr-un-Nissa was set aside, and she became Nur Jahan, light of the world. But behind the poetry of her title lay the beginning of a different rule, one shaped not by inheritance, but by careful observation, ruthless patience, and a quiet certainty that the empire could be guided from behind the curtain. Those who once overlooked her would soon speak her name in whispers. She had entered the center of power, and somewhere in the court, someone already knew it would never be the same. Mer-un-Nissa's first marriage, arranged under the authority of the Mughal court, positioned her beside Ali Quli Khan, later known by his imperial title, Shah Afghan. As a nobleman of Persian descent who had risen in the Mughal military ranks, he was stationed in Bengal, a distant and politically sensitive region on the empire's eastern edge. Life there offered neither luxury nor influence. Bengal was valuable to the empire, but fraught with unrest, and the officers assigned to it were often those the court needed to keep at a distance. For Mer-un-Nissa, the years in Bengal were marked not by grandeur, but by watching power unfold from its periphery. She witnessed how loyalty was rewarded, how disobedience was punished, and how imperial reach extended through appointed hands, loyal only while convenient. The details surrounding Shah Afghan's death in 1607 remain unclear, but the impact was immediate and deeply political. Official records claimed he resisted imperial orders, engaging in a violent confrontation with Qutbuddin Khan, the governor of Bengal and a trusted agent of the emperor. Whether the incident was a spontaneous rebellion or a planned removal remains debated, but its outcome was decisive. Shah Afghan was killed, and Mer-un-Nissa was taken into custody, not as a criminal, but as a political figure too important to be left unmonitored. She was brought to Agra and placed within the harem of Emperor Jahangir, a space that concealed more than it revealed. On the surface, it was a place of retreat for royal women, sealed off from the public world. But behind its latticed windows and guarded gates, it served as a quiet theater of power. The Mughal harem housed hundreds of women, wives, concubines, attendants, and royal relatives. It was governed by strict protocols, but its walls carried the echoes of politics. Here, imperial wives formed alliances, brokered favors, and acted as informal advisors through indirect influence. Servants carried messages, gifts held meaning, silence could shape succession. It was within this structure that Mer-un-Nissa began to understand the deeper mechanics of Mughal governance, not in military orders or court decrees, but in subtle gestures, cautious movements, and timed loyalties. Her lineage, her intellect, and her awareness made her impossible to ignore, even within the enclosure meant to contain her. Emperor Jahangir, known for his fondness for art, opulence, and indulgence, ruled over a court filled with shifting alliances. His reliance on close aides and family members to maintain balance created a space in which influence could emerge from unexpected places. It was during this period of internal instability that Mer-un-Nissa's presence began to register more clearly. She had no title, no claim to imperial blood, and no formal role, yet she carried herself with restraint and calculation. The harem was designed to silence women, but she learned to listen to the currents beneath the surface. Every gesture, every whisper, every decision, she followed them all. By the time Jahangir's gaze turned toward her in 1611, it was not by accident. Her patience had held long enough for opportunity to draw near. The emperor's marriage to her was seen by many as impulsive, even dangerous. But within the harem, where rivalries simmered and loyalties shifted, it was clear something more complex had begun. Mer-un-Nissa emerged not only as a consort, but as a political presence. Behind her eyes lay a knowledge of how power moved when no one was looking. And once she stepped through that threshold, the quiet politics of the harem would no longer remain behind the curtain. When Emperor Jahangir married her in 1611, Nur Jahan did not inherit authority. She created it. As the 20th wife in the Mughal Zanana, expectations were low. The court had seen emperors take consorts before, and most faded behind silk veils and ceremonial roles. But from the moment she entered the imperial household as empress, Nur Jahan moved with precision. She adopted the rhythms of power with a clarity that unsettled the court. Jahangir, aging and increasingly dependent on opiates and alcohol, remained the symbolic head of empire. But those who read the edicts, followed the appointments, and tracked the movements of courtly favor began to see that a different hand was guiding imperial direction. Nur Jahan's ascent did not begin with declarations, but with reforms in courtly conduct. She altered royal protocol to allow herself visible presence, appearing with Jahangir at public audiences and accompanying him on military campaigns. She took part in imperial hunts, a traditionally male domain, and received foreign dignitaries, an act reserved only for high-ranking members of the ruling elite. More significantly, she gained the unprecedented right to issue farmans, imperial decrees, bearing her own seal. For the first time in Mughal history, a woman's signature carried the full weight of state power. Her name was minted onto silver coins alongside the emperor's. It was a quiet revolution carried out through existing structures, but reshaping them from within. Her family's rise mirrored her own. Giyas Beg, now titled Itimad-ud-Dawla, was elevated to chief minister, overseeing state finances and becoming the principal figure in managing the empire's treasury. Her brother, Asaf Khan, climbed the ranks of military and administrative office, eventually becoming one of the most powerful nobles at court. Together, the three formed what came to be known as the Nur Jahan junta, a network of loyalty and kinship that stabilized the court while simultaneously concentrating power in her immediate circle. While many nobles had gained prominence through conquest or service, Nur Jahan's allies gained it through access to her voice, her attention, her proximity to the emperor. It was a shift that some called loyalty and others called manipulation. Jahangir remained the emperor in name and ceremony. He presided over court rituals, held public audiences, and engaged in the arts and architecture. But illness and addiction often pulled him away from daily governance. During these moments, Nur Jahan's control became more visible. She managed diplomatic correspondence, resolved court disputes, and approved appointments. Even when Jahangir was present, she was no longer behind the curtain. She was beside the throne. Her decisions reflected a complex balance of imperial responsibility and personal strategy. She arranged marriages that aligned loyalties, appointed governors who owed their status to her patronage, and strengthened the empire's financial systems through her father's bureaucratic skill. But not all welcomed her authority. Certain nobles resented the concentration of power within a single family. Others viewed her public role as a violation of courtly tradition. In a world where male lineage and conquest had defined legitimacy, a woman's command, no matter how legal, was seen by many as dangerous. Some quietly withdrew their support, while others began to form new alliances beyond the court's immediate center. Nur Jahan's rule had not emerged from rebellion or violence. It had risen through presence, layered, deliberate, and unmistakable. Yet with every step forward, resistance began to take root in silence. Not every noble bowed willingly, and not every prince planned to remain in her shadow. In the marble halls of Agra, the architecture stood firm, but the structure of loyalty began to shift beneath it. As Nur Jahan expanded her control over imperial matters, a quiet resistance gathered around her. Not in the form of open rebellion, but in the tightening silences of the royal family. Jahangir's sons, each with imperial ambitions of their own, watched her ascend from within the zenana to the very center of court power. To them, she was not merely an empress, she was a barrier. Prince Khusrau, Jahangir's eldest, had already tested the limits of obedience years earlier, having led a failed rebellion in 1606. Though partially reconciled with his father, he remained under scrutiny, but it was Prince Khurram, later known as Shah Jahan, who emerged as both favored heir and growing threat. As Nur Jahan placed her family members in key roles and directed the course of succession with increasing precision, her vision for imperial continuity became unmistakable. She orchestrated military appointments and courtly marriages to fortify her position, ensuring that loyalty to her became inseparable from loyalty to the empire. In this strategy, her daughter from her first marriage, Ladli Begum, played a central role. The empress sought to bind the royal line to her own blood, attempting to marry Ladli to Prince Khurram. But he refused. His rejection was not only personal, it was political. By denying the match, he denied her influence over the imperial future. Instead, Nur Jahan arranged Ladli's marriage to Prince Shahrayar, Jahangir's youngest and weakest son, creating a rival line of succession with fewer claims but firmer loyalty. This act deepened fractures in the royal household. As Jahangir's health declined, his absences from court grew longer and more frequent. He was often consumed by illness or retreating into the comforts of wine and opiates, leaving governance to the empress and her council. Decisions once mediated by the emperor now moved through Nur Jahan's hands. She issued farmans, received ambassadors, and presided over courtly matters, while balancing delicate tribal, religious, and regional tensions across the empire. Yet with every decree she signed, the distance between her and the imperial princes widened. What had once been admired as skill began to be seen by her rivals as overreach. Within the court, rumors sharpened into accusations, whispered doubts passed between nobles, questioning whether the empress governed for the empire's stability or her own dynasty's rise. Nur Jahan understood the fragility of power built on perception. She tightened her inner circle, depended more heavily on her father and brother, and reduced her trust in those who had not already pledged themselves to her cause. The very traits that had brought her to power, patience, calculation, decisiveness, were now mirrored back to her as signs of ambition too bold for the Mughal tradition. Prince Khurram, once cooperative and loyal, began to reposition himself. As one of the most accomplished generals of the empire and a favorite of Jahangir in earlier years, he had the military backing, noble alliances, and vision to act. What he lacked was control over the court, and that lay with Nur Jahan. The empress had bent protocol, rewritten roles, and placed herself at the center of succession. But power, once shifted, does not settle quietly. The mirror that once reflected her authority now revealed growing cracks. And somewhere beyond the lattice screens, a prince began gathering strength, not to serve beside her, but to stand in her place. In 1622, the Mughal Empire, still vast and admired, turned inward. The rupture did not come from beyond its borders, but from the heart of its own dynasty. Prince Khurram, once groomed as heir and celebrated for his military conquests in the Deccan and against the Persians in Kandahar, withdrew his loyalty from the court. The cause, framed publicly as concern over imperial mismanagement, masked deeper grievances: resentment toward Nur Jahan's control, distrust of her rising faction, and a refusal to see the empire steered by hands that were not his. The rebellion began not as a declaration, but as a refusal to follow orders. Khurram, commanding a loyal army, resisted imperial summons and began maneuvering for position, claiming to act in the empire's interest while drawing lines against it. Nur Jahan moved swiftly. With Emperor Jahangir's health continuing to decline and his involvement in daily rule reduced to ceremonial functions, it fell to the Empress to maintain the empire's cohesion. She assembled forces loyal to the court, directed generals who still followed her lead, and negotiated with provincial commanders to block Khurram's path. Her authority, already contested in whispers, now faced direct challenge on the field. But she did not retreat. Instead, she crafted a strategy not only of war, but of appearances, balancing shows of force with calculated diplomacy to preserve the image of imperial unity. She understood that this was not just a military rebellion. It was a public test of the legitimacy she had built over a decade. The conflict stretched across multiple fronts. Battles were fought in the north and the Deccan, where provincial loyalty was split and supplies uncertain. In Bengal and the Punjab, alliances had to be secured through promises and, at times, quiet threats. Within the court, the pressure mounted. Some nobles who had once supported her now hesitated, unsure of where the future lay. Others waited to see which side would tip the balance. Jahangir, increasingly isolated and under the care of those closest to Nur Jahan, was no longer in command of the empire he once ruled. His voice still echoed in the halls of power, but it no longer dictated events. From the throne, he watched as his own son challenged the woman who had become the stabilizing force of his reign. Nur Jahan's response was not only military, it was personal. She directed the marriage of her daughter, Ladli Begum, to Shahryar, Jahangir's youngest son, a move intended to strengthen her claim to succession and counter Khurram's ambition. The court, already fractured, now saw the emergence of two competing visions for the future. One rooted in Nur Jahan's continued influence through Shahryar, and another driven by Khurram's campaign to seize power directly. The empire no longer moved as one. Its governors weighed their loyalties. Its armies fought under split banners, and its people, who once looked to the emperor for continuity, now watched a royal family at war with itself. The rebellion was eventually forced into retreat, but the wounds it left behind would not close. Blood had been drawn between father and son, between ruler and prince, between court and battlefield. Nur Jahan had defended her place with resolve, but at a cost that reshaped the trust at the empire's core. In the Mughal court, power could be shared or seized, but once violence entered the lineage, no reconciliation came without suspicion. The empire still stood, but something irreversible had shifted beneath its marble and gold. Even as the dust of rebellion settled and Prince Khurram withdrew from open confrontation, a deeper erosion had begun within the palace walls. The Mughal Empire remained intact, its cities still humming with commerce and its court adorned with ceremony, but the center of power no longer felt firm. Emperor Jahangir, once the axis of imperial authority, appeared less and less. His physical health declined rapidly, plagued by years of illness, dependence on opiates and wine, and the lingering toll of internal instability. In his growing absence, Nur Jahan's role shifted from influence to necessity. She no longer acted as an advisor. She functioned as the governing force itself. Edicts continued to bear his name, but the decisions behind them were hers. The image of a co-sovereign, once whispered in admiration, now became a subject of discomfort. For over a decade, Nur Jahan had carefully shaped the court in her likeness, appointing loyalists, directing state finances through her father, managing diplomatic correspondence, and maintaining control over access to the emperor. But as Jahangir withdrew into his inner chambers, her dominance grew more visible, and the structure she built began to cast a shadow over itself. What had once been praised as competence in a moment of imperial vulnerability now invited accusations of overreach. Her coinage still circulated, bearing inscriptions that named her as Empress Nur Jahan, light of the world. But in private, fewer hands carried them with pride. Symbolism turned brittle when not held up by shared trust. Court factions, once silenced through careful patronage, began to regroup. Nobles who had stepped aside during her rise now returned to the foreground, waiting for the moment when imperial transition would bring new opportunity. Among them stood Asaf Khan, her own brother, who had once risen with her but now began realigning himself with Prince Khurram. The alliances that had formed the core of her authority no longer held the same weight. They had been crafted in service of a shared vision. But with the emperor fading, that vision no longer anchored the court. Even those who owed their careers to her began to look elsewhere, calculating futures beyond her reach. Nur Jahan did not step back. She continued to manage the affairs of state, led the imperial entourage on travel circuits, and remained visible during public ceremonies. But the coldness had settled in. Not a rebellion, not yet. Rather, it was a subtle resistance, a refusal to echo her voice, a quiet reorganization of loyalties behind curtains she could no longer part. Her daughter, Ladli Begum, whose marriage had once symbolized the empress's dynastic hopes, now lived within a court where her name no longer invoked the same reverence. The marriage to Shahryar, Jahangir's youngest son, had secured a claim on paper, but in practice, the court's gaze had shifted elsewhere. The future no longer revolved around the empress's plan. It moved on its own. By 1627, Jahangir's presence had nearly vanished from public life, his body weakened by age and dependency. He remained confined during long journeys and retreated from state affairs entirely. Nur Jahan stayed beside him, managing logistics, hosting emissaries, answering petitions. But the silence between her authority and the empire's heart widened. The peacock throne still stood, gleaming in the Diwani Khas, but its warmth was gone. Its voice had faded, and the breath of the emperor, the one constant behind her power, was now thin, labored, and slipping further with each passing day. In the autumn of 1627, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir died on his return from Kashmir. His death was not dramatic nor sudden, but its impact moved with quiet speed. As his body was carried toward Lahore, wrapped in royal silence, the empire shifted. Nur Jahan, who had governed in his name for years, now stood at the edge of power, with no sovereign behind her. The moment the emperor's breath ceased, the system she had built, carefully, deliberately, and against every precedent, began to fracture. The court, sensing the vacuum, moved not with grief, but with calculation. And among the first to turn was Asaf Khan, her own brother. Asaf Khan had once been among Nur Jahan's most trusted allies. His elevation had been part of her broader strategy to consolidate authority through family ties. But he understood what many now accepted. The empire would not allow a woman to control the succession, and the court would not accept another ruler molded by her hand. In the days following Jahangir's death, Asaf Khan acted quickly. He aligned himself with Prince Khurram, the rebellious son who had once risen against Nur Jahan and now waited in the background under the name history would come to know, Shah Jahan. Asaf Khan declared his support for Khurram's claim to the throne, mobilizing troops, securing loyal factions, and taking possession of court communications and routes. The seals that once passed through Nur Jahan's chamber now changed direction. Nur Jahan, still in possession of the late emperor's body, attempted to guide the narrative. She supported Shahryar, Jahangir's youngest son, and her son-in-law, hoping to preserve her influence through proximity to the throne. But Shahryar held no real command and no meaningful support beyond the few who remained bound by personal loyalty. The marriage alliance with her daughter, Ladli Begum, once a cornerstone of Nur Jahan's dynastic plan, now carried no weight. Khurram's forces advanced. Within days, Asaf Khan had taken control of Agra fort and ensured that Shah Jahan's path to coronation would face no serious resistance. What unfolded was not a civil war, but a reordering of loyalties. The court did not rise in rebellion. It simply turned away. The betrayals that followed were quiet. Officials who had once stood at her side now spoke with caution, waiting to see where the tide would settle. Her correspondence was intercepted. Messages went unanswered. The imperial guards that had once accompanied her travels were reassigned. Without Jahangir's signature, her authority no longer moved through the empire. She was not imprisoned. She was not exiled. But every channel of influence she had once controlled was taken from her, piece by piece. What she had built over nearly 2 decades, through strategy, through marriage, through control of the coin and the sword, was now pulled away by hands she had once lifted. For Nur Jahan, the silence was unmistakable. It was not dramatic or immediate. It came in the form of sealed doors, redirected caravans, cancelled audiences. The empire did not reject her with noise. It moved on without her. In the end, the power she had once commanded did not fall by force. It dissolved in quiet betrayal, led not by her enemies, but by those who had once owed their futures to her name. With Shah Jahan's coronation in 1628, the world Nur Jahan had shaped no longer needed her name. She was not formally condemned. She was not cast out. Yet in a court where presence meant power, she vanished. Her title remained, but its meaning no longer moved men or ministries. The corridors that once echoed with her instructions fell silent. The coinage bearing her name was withdrawn. The edicts she had once issued with imperial seal were replaced by those under a new sovereign's hand. No charges were brought, no trials were held. The court simply looked past her, as though the empire she had governed had never required her guidance at all. Her residence in Agra grew quiet, emptied of attendance and stripped of ceremonial function. Her daughter, Ladli Begum, still lived by her side, but without title or courtly purpose. The marriage to Shahryar, which had once carried the weight of dynastic hope, had ended in blood. Shortly after Jahangir's death, Shah Jahan ordered the execution of his surviving rivals, including Shahryar. It was not personal, it was procedure. But for Nur Jahan, it was a final erasure of her plans. The empire that she had ruled by proximity now carried forward without trace of her lineage. There was no seat for Ladli at court, no alliances left to forge, no heirs to protect. What remained was not governance, it was survival. She withdrew to Lahore, once a favored city during her years of power, now a place of quiet retreat. There, in relative seclusion, she lived out her final years. She had wealth, land, and the respect of some who remembered her rule. But she had no voice in the empire's direction. Her letters no longer commanded response. Her judgments no longer influenced appointments. The woman who had once issued farmans and managed the pulse of imperial diplomacy now managed household affairs and commissioned architecture. Yet even in this diminished role, her discipline endured. She oversaw the construction of Jahangir's tomb on the banks of the Ravi River, an elegant structure inlaid with marble and Persian motifs, designed not as a monument to herself, but as an enduring reflection of the emperor she had once served. Nur Jahan never attempted a return to power. She wrote no memoirs, left no declarations, and made no appeals to the throne. The silence that defined her final decade was not one of defeat. It was a removal, gradual and absolute. Under Shah Jahan, the court became more formal, more orthodox, and more distant. Women of the Zenana no longer held the same reach. The empire turned its gaze to new monuments, new conquests, and a future that did not include her shadow. Her governance was not remembered in proclamations. It was remembered in the decisions others no longer credited to her hand. She died in 1645 in Lahore, far from the throne, far from the noise of empire. She was buried in a modest tomb near Jahangir's grand mausoleum. Its stone bore no royal inscription, only a brief line that marked the passing of a widow. Yet even in that simplicity, something endured. She had once ruled an empire, not through lineage or conquest, but through command of presence. In the silence that followed her, the memory of that command did not vanish. It settled, in stone, in rumor, in the records of those who had once obeyed her voice, even if they later chose to forget it. In 1645, Nur Jahan died in Lahore. There was no royal proclamation, no mourning declared across the empire, no state funeral lined with banners of her once glorious titles. She was buried in a modest tomb near the grand mausoleum of her late husband, Emperor Jahangir. The site stood quiet on the outskirts of power, its marble softened by dust and time. For years, she had shaped the direction of an empire, guided the hand of a monarch, and influenced the court with precision that few had dared to match. Yet in the final record of her death, there was no ceremony to echo the force she had once been. Her grave bore a single line, unadorned, unsentimental, marking her place in the ground, but not the history she had helped write. Her fall had not been swift or dramatic. It came in silence, drawn out over years, through the slow unraveling of alliances and the deliberate closing of doors. Once Shah Jahan took power, her name disappeared from official records. Her policies were reversed. Her appointments were replaced. Her architecture remained, but her influence was removed without conflict. For an empire that had once been governed by her will, it was as if she had never ruled at all. Yet her absence did not erase what she had built. The systems she helped stabilize continued to function. The administration she shaped, the diplomacy she refined, the court culture she transformed, all endured even when her name was no longer spoken. The Mughal dynasty did not return to stability after her departure. Instead, it entered a new phase, one of grandeur and rigidity. Shah Jahan, the son who had once rebelled against her, emerged as a powerful ruler known for monuments rather than balance. Under his reign, the empire saw the construction of the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort, symbols of imperial ambition that dazzled the world. But behind these structures lay a deeper consolidation of power, one that allowed little room for shared influence. Shah Jahan's control became absolute, but with it came suspicion. His own sons would soon mirror the rivalries he once lived through, and the empire would fracture again in another generation, not from external attack, but from within. In this legacy of internal struggle, Nur Jahan's absence became its own kind of presence. She had offered a different model of power, one that relied on negotiation, alliance, and strategic patience. Her rule was not marked by conquest, but by coordination. When she governed, the court had been held in balance between military ambition and administrative discipline. When she fell, that balance shifted towards splendor and eventual cruelty. Her defiance of succession norms, her manipulation of court factions, and her willingness to wield power from within the zenana had made her both feared and admired. But her choices also made her vulnerable to erasure. No histories commissioned by later emperors celebrated her role. No volumes praised her leadership, but fragments remained, in architecture, in coinage, in court records, that bore her seal for over a decade. Those who studied the empire's turning points found her name buried beneath layers of silence. And in the dust of old silver coins, where her title once shared space with the emperors, her story quietly waited, half remembered, half erased, but never undone. Nur Jahan's reign did not leave behind a lineage to carry her vision forward. There was no son to ascend a throne under her name, no dynasty rooted in her blood. Yet her legacy, though untethered from succession, pressed its shape into the empire she once helped govern. She was the only woman in Mughal history to wield sovereign power without a crown, to issue imperial orders under her own seal, to have her name inscribed on currency, and to direct military campaigns from behind the curtain of the zenana. In a world where authority passed from father to son, Nur Jahan demonstrated how power could be taken, not inherited, earned through strategy, vision, and presence rather than birthright. Her influence did not vanish with her fall. It remained embedded in the structures she once directed. The administrative network she helped strengthen through her father, Itimad-ud-Dawla, continued to support the Mughal court for years to come. The use of imperial symbolism, titles, seals, coins, as tools of legitimacy had reached new levels under her direction. Her mastery of court protocol and ceremonial presentation became a model of how power could be projected through controlled appearances. The architectural projects she supported, such as the tomb of Jahangir and the garden layouts that blended Persian aesthetics with local designs, shaped the stylistic foundations of what would soon emerge under Shah Jahan. In form and scale, the Taj Mahal echoed not only the legacy of Mumtaz Mahal, but the architectural and political language refined during Nur Jahan's time. Even Shah Jahan's own rise owed something to her decisions. It was Nur Jahan who, for a time, restrained him, challenged him and ultimately forced him to secure his claim with urgency. Her confrontation with him in the years leading up to Jahangir's death hardened the prince's alliances, disciplined his ambitions, and prompted him to prepare not only for rule, but for survival. The deaths of rival princes following his coronation, the restructuring of the court, and the centralization of authority under his name all reflected lessons drawn from the chaos that followed her regency. She had governed through complexity, balancing court factions, religious divisions, and military logistics, and in doing so, exposed the vulnerabilities of imperial succession. The son who defied her inherited not just the throne, but the consequences of a system she had made visible. But her legacy also carried a deeper unease. To some, she had overstepped. Her centralization of power within her family, her manipulation of dynastic marriages, and her control of the emperor's schedule and access raised concerns that outlived her. Later, emperors tightened the roles of women in the imperial court, reducing their influence and limiting the political reach of the harem. The memory of Nur Jahan's authority, rather than opening doors for others, may have closed them. Her presence had stretched the boundaries of what was permissible, and in doing so, provoked a quiet reaction that redefined them more narrowly. Her rule had revealed the potential of power outside of traditional structures, and in response, those structures reinforced themselves with greater rigidity. Still, her legacy lingered, more in echoes than inscriptions. Her coins, rare and carefully preserved, offer tangible proof of a period when a woman's name held fiscal and political weight. Her architectural patronage survives in Lahore and Agra, in gardens and tombs that carried her vision of beauty, order, and permanence. Her administrative model influenced the bureaucratic structure of the empire, even as her name faded from its honors. Historians, centuries later, would debate her image, some casting her as a cunning manipulator who dismantled the norms of dynastic rule, others as a capable regent who stabilized a fragile empire at its most uncertain hour. Nur Jahan governed not by accident, but by choice, strategic, measured, and relentless. She ruled an empire through influence, silence, and sharp decisions made under constraint. Her ambition was not hidden, but embedded in every act of control she carried out in Jahangir's name. She was both a product of her time and a force that reshaped it. And as the Mughal Empire moved toward its own internal unraveling in the generations that followed, her story remained a point of tension. Was she the stabilizing hand in a broken court, or the presence that deepened its fractures? She left behind no heir to defend her name, but history has not forgotten it. It remains carved into coins, scattered in court records, and reflected in the balance of power she once held. Her legacy, like the empire she ruled, was not built to last forever. But in the long shadow of the Mughal dynasty, her image lingers, not as empress by title, but as something more rare. A ruler, born of necessity, remembered in the spaces where power once moved quietly in her direction.